So you may have heard a story. Fortunate businessmen. Three businessmen had just completed a very lucrative venture. They worked tirelessly to create the best possible product and schmooze the suppliers to get the best discounts and wine and dine their clients to make the best possible deals. And it seemed like everything they did just worked. They could do no wrong. And now countless hours of researching and organizing and networking had finally paid off. And the three of them, being God-fearing men, agreed that they should, in light of the blessings they received, give something back to the Lord. So they had only to determine how much. And they looked at each other in a long, awkward silence until at last one of them spoke. "I know what we'll do," he said. "Let's draw a circle on the ground. We'll throw the money in the air. Whatever lands in the circle, we give to God." With very little consideration, another one piped up. "I have a better idea. Draw your circle on the ground. We'll throw the money way in the air. Whatever lands outside the circle, we give to God." And the last one finally offered his thoughts. "Forget the circle on the ground. Throw the money way up in the air. Whatever God wants, he'll just keep." And these three hopefully fictitious men didn't know how to honor the Lord with their finances. They knew they should. They just didn't know how. They knew it was right to give something back to God, but they didn't know how much or how to give it. And that might be because they, like many well-meaning individuals, didn't understand how to worship God with their finances. For those who are newer to faith or newer to the teaching of the church, you may not see a connection between financial giving and worship. For those who've been around for a while, you may see giving as an act of worship. And that's true. Sometimes giving is worship. But every time, worship is giving. Worship always requires something to be given. And so today, we're going to learn why worship is giving and how to worship with our finances. So to understand the connection between giving and worship, we first have to understand what worship is. And that's a topic I spent a lot of time dwelling on. As a worship pastor, I want to know what worship is, have a firm grasp on that, and how to do it. Worship, simply put, is ascribing worth to something. Worship is ascribing worth to something. It's saying someone is worth my effort, my time, my attention, my resources. Worship is an action taken or a word spoken or a gift given to express that you value the recipient. So when we do give our time, our effort, or our possession, the worth is ascribed to them, the person receiving that. And just to be clear, when we make a purchase, that's different. When we buy something, we're placing value in an item based on our need or our desire for that item. We're not ascribing worth to the supplier of that item. So when I go to QT for gas and breakfast, I'm not paying $2.50 a gallon and $3 for a bacon taco just because Anthony behind the counter is the best cashier to ever cashier. No matter how big he smiles or fast he scans, it's not about him. A transaction is not an act of worship. A gift is. Whenever we give something or anything of ourselves without expecting something in return, that's a gift. And when that gift is given to express that we value someone or that we value our relationship with them, that is an act of worship. So when we attend a service like today, we're giving our time and our energy. And if you're a parent of children that are too young to responsibly dress themselves, you're giving a lot of time and energy to being here today so that you can ascribe worth to the Lord and to the gathering of his people. When we sing songs like we just did, we're giving our voice, our breath, our strength to ascribe worth to him. Worship requires us to give something. Giving is essential to worship. Giving is essential to worship. If we give nothing, if our worship doesn't cost us something, it isn't worship. It isn't worship because there's no worth being presented. If at your birthday you received a gift, a beautifully wrapped box, just perfect. The corners are all clean and crisp and you can't see any tape and the ribbon's not twisted at all and the bow is just perfectly centered. One of those gifts you feel guilty about unwrapping. Okay, you've gotten one of those before. You're like, oh, I don't want to unwrap it. It's so perfect. But that always just kind of devolves into that animalistic aggression, and you wind up just tearing off the paper and you rip open the box, but you find that it is empty. There's nothing there. Nothing of value, nothing of worth. At best, you would feel not valued, but more likely you would feel devalued, perhaps insulted. The giver, or in this case, wrapper of empty boxes, presented nothing of worth. They did not express any value in you as a person or their relationship with you. Because worship requires that we present something of worth. And that's why worship is giving, because giving is essential to worship, which prompts us to ask, just like those businessmen, then how much do we give? And this is a really easy question to answer in principle, but a hard question to answer in practice. In principle, we just do like the old song says, all to Jesus I surrender. You know how it goes, all to him I freely give. When the worship pastor preaches, you get a free song. So there you go. It's really, really simple in principle. In practice, it is difficult, especially with our money. It's not so cut and dry or poetic, because we're supposed to be wise with our finances. We're supposed to know, and give, and save, like Pastor Craig taught last week. And if that give component is where worship occurs, then what do you give to express the value you place in the Lord? What do you get for the God who literally owns everything in the entire universe? That's where it gets difficult, because our tendency is to assign an amount of money to the worth we want to express, and it always fails to measure up. I'll give you an example from my life, a little glimpse into my world. My wife is a gift giver, not a wrapper of empty boxes. She's a gift giver. That's her love language. It is not mine. I am acts of service. I am, what can I do for you to show you that I care? But she puts so much thought and attention into the gifts that she gives. It's inspiring, but I'm not wired that way. So when we have, a birthday coming up or Christmas, we have two different objectives. I find that the act of giving the gift expresses that we value the relationship with the one receiving it. Brittany wants the value of the gift to express the worth of the relationship. And we've learned to compromise and meet in the middle so that she's not robbed of the joy of giving, and I'm not robbed of the discipline of our budget, and our children aren't robbed of trivial things like food, shelter, and clothing. But deciding that value is difficult because we both know we can't assign a dollar amount to the worth of the person or of the relationship. How do you put a dollar amount to properly express your appreciation to your mother for bringing you into the world? And I look over here because mine's over here right now, and that's I'm gonna cry. Or more to our point here, how much money could we possibly give to the God who gave his one and only Son to save our wretched souls? We worship a God worthy of far more than we could ever possibly give, dollar for dollar, pound for pound. Which is why the worth of our giving, or I'll say the worshipfulness of our giving, is measured in proportion. It's measured by sacrifice. Let's go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. And as you're turning, I want to set the stage for what might be a familiar story. Throughout the Old Testament, the people of Israel are commanded to come to the defense and aid of widows, those who have no one to provide for them and plead their cause. That's why there's laws written throughout Deuteronomy to ensure that a widow doesn't starve or get taken advantage of. And here in Mark chapter 12, verse 41, we have a widow and her offering. Your Bible probably has a subheading there. It says something like the widow's mite or the widow's offering, but I want to read a couple verses before that. So starting in verse 38. Jesus also taught, "Beware of these teachers of religious law, for they like to parade around in flowing robes and receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honor in synagogues and the head table at banquets. Yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property and then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, they will be more severely punished. Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts, then a poor widow, perhaps one of these that had been cheated by the religious leaders, came and dropped in 2 small coins. And Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions. For they gave a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on. Whenever the Bible says that Jesus told his disciples or called his disciples to himself and said, I always picture it kind of like a football huddle. It gets them all in close so he can tell them something he doesn't mean for everyone else to hear. Like here with the widow, the disciples are probably watching all the wealthy just pour coins into the coffers, letting small pieces of precious metal splash about and make a scene just to be seen. Then the widow, who's been patiently waiting for the pomp and circumstance of the wealthy to subside, humbly steps up, maybe even embarrassed, and drops in 2 small coins that barely make a sound as they land on far more grandiose offerings. And that's when Jesus draws the attention of the disciples. He's just like, guys, come here. Come here. Watch this. Watch this. There, did you see that? Did you see that? She put in everything. She gave it all. Now that's a gift. He doesn't call them in to judge the wealthy. He doesn't call them in to praise the widow. He didn't go up and shake her hand. He called their attention to the gift. It was about sacrifice. This woman who had been a recipient, would have been a recipient of a benevolence fund, was most likely living off of generous contributions from others and distributions from the temple, gives everything she had to live on. She sacrifices all her resources to honor the Lord because worship is sacrificial. Worship is sacrificial. From the beginning of time with Cain and Abel through the laws and ordinances of Israel, worship has always been an act of sacrifice. It hasn't been about the songs that we sing or when we gather or what we wear. It's about giving up something that we hold dear to demonstrate that we hold him in higher regard. Worship is giving. Worship is sacrificial. So we should give sacrificially. And that's the first way that we worship with our finances. We give sacrificially. And this is not a call to empty your bank account like the widow did. If God tells you to do that, be obedient, but there better be a burning bush or a pillar of cloud and fire or some undeniable and verifiable event instructing you to do so, because we should be wise with our finances as we give sacrificially, which means we need to have a plan, which means we need a budget for sacrificial giving. Whatever your budgeting process is, put a line in there for giving. And then go one step further. Find an item in your budget you can live without and apply that balance to that sacrificial giving line. Maybe that's not getting Starbucks for a week. Imagine how generous you could be with that $300. Maybe you turn Netflix off for a couple months. Whatever it is, set it aside. Let that be your sacrifice, because worship is sacrificial. Worship is giving, so we should plan on giving sacrificially. And David understood this. King David knew what this was about. There's a story in 2 Samuel. You can go ahead and turn there. I'll give you a moment to find it. 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 18. And there's 2 accounts of this story in Scripture. One's in 2 Samuel, which we're about to read. The other one is in 1 Chronicles. And there are 2 differences between these accounts. One of them is the name of the Jebusite man. In 2 Samuel, he's called Arana. In 1 Chronicles, he's called Ornan. And that's not a big deal, just a variation of the same name. Be like saying in 2 Samuel, he's called Robert, and in 1 Chronicles, he's called Bobby. It's the same guy. So don't get hung up on that. The other difference is the amount that David paid. And that's much more significant, and we'll get to it in just a second. So 2 Samuel chapter 24, starting in verse 18. That day, Gad, who's kind of like David's in-house prophet, came to David and said to him, "Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." So David went up to do what the Lord had commanded him. When Araunah saw the king and his men coming toward him, he came and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. "Why have you come, my lord the king?" Araunah asked. And David replied, "I've come to buy your threshing floor and to build an altar to the Lord there, so he will stop the plague." "Take it, my lord the king, and use it as you wish," Araunah said to David. "Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and you can use the threshing boards and ox yokes for wood to build a fire on the altar. I will give it all to you, your majesty, and may the Lord your God accept your sacrifice." But the king replied to Araunah, "No, I insist on buying it, for I will not present burnt offerings to the Lord my God that have cost me nothing." So David paid him 50 pieces of silver for the threshing floor and the oxen. And David built an altar there to the Lord and sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings. "I will not present burnt offerings to the Lord my God that have cost me nothing." David knew that if he accepted that gift from Araunah, he would have just been facilitating someone else's sacrifice, someone else's worship. He wouldn't be giving anything at all. He knew he had to offer something of himself, so he pays 50 shekels of silver for the oxen and the threshing floor. Here's a picture of a threshing floor. Just a circular spot of land where an ox or donkey would drag a heavy board over stalks of grain to break the grain free from the husks. It's pretty simple. So 50 shekels of silver was probably a fair amount, and it makes a great spot for an altar. But 50 shekels of silver isn't really a sacrifice for a king. Valuation of biblical currency is non-exact science, but 50 shekels of silver probably represents somewhere between $500 and $1,000. And it's not like David's going to find that in the couch cushions, but it's not a huge financial consideration. Which brings us to the second difference between 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles says that he paid not 50 shekels of silver, but 600 shekels of gold. This might have been around $500,000. That's a different number. So why does 2 Samuel say 50 shekels and 1 Chronicles say 600 shekels of gold? The 50 shekels of silver was paid to purchase the oxen and threshing floor. The 600 shekels of gold was to purchase the field it was in, a massive tract of land. And he purchased the land for the construction of the temple. He purchased the land to give it to the Lord. Now, David had an army. He could have just taken it. I mean, he was a king. He could have just claimed it. Araunah was a God-fearing man who was willing to give it. He could have just accepted it. But David was a worshiper. Before he was a general, before he was a king, he was a worshiper. And so he paid for it. He made a sacrifice, a massive sacrifice, a worshipful sacrifice. It's a great example of giving sacrificially. It wasn't just a sacrifice, it met a need. It provided a place for the temple to be built. See, unlike our three illustrious businessmen from before tossing dollars in the air, David purchased this land with specific intent. He had a cause. So while the widow's mite, her offering may have gone to the general fund, David's went to the building program. And David didn't claim an exemption from other offerings. He didn't stop making regular offerings because he had given all this money for the temple. This was above and beyond. It was a sacrifice. And yes, a sacrifice that also met a need. The burnt offerings were purely an act of worship. They didn't meet a need. There wasn't a shortage of charred cattle in Israel. But the purchase of an offering of the land was a worshipful sacrifice that met a need. And so just in case you're wondering if meeting a need undermines the act of worship, no. Giving financially to meet a need does not negate the worshipfulness of the gift. In his letter to the church in Philippi, the Apostle Paul says, "At the moment I have all I need and more. I am generously supplied with the gifts you sent me with Epaphroditus. They are a sweet-smelling sacrifice that is acceptable and pleasing to God." The gifts were sent to Paul to provide for him, to generously supply him with all that he needed. And yet they're called a sweet-smelling sacrifice that is pleasing to God. The gifts to Paul are regarded as worship to God. Hebrews 13:16 says, "Don't forget to do good and to share with those in need. These are the sacrifices that please God." Sharing with those in need is a sacrifice that pleases God. And that's the second way we worship with our finances. We give to meet a need, and it ascribes worth to him. It's worship. We don't offer burnt offerings anymore. It's not part of our system. If you have a stack of cash at home that you are just itching to light on fire, please don't. Don't do that. We don't do that here. It's not how it works. Our offerings, our gifts, our contributions, our sacrifices are used to do good and to meet needs. And sometimes that's specific, like buying groceries for a single parent or fixing an elderly widow's roof. And sometimes it's more general, like giving to the church and trusting the Lord to lead the church to use that in a way that honors him. But our giving is used to meet needs. And many times, God uses our giving to do far more than we could on our own. I mean, Jesus feeds 5,000 people with a gift from a boy. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish and hands it over, and Jesus miraculously feeds the masses with it. About 10 years ago, I was at a church in a smaller town, and there was a young couple there that just gotten married, and she had a couple kids. And so their family of 4 was a little too big for their one truck with a bench seat and 3 seat belts. And so another couple in the church that didn't have kids that time figured out how to live with one car so they could give the other one to this family. And that's a wonderful story. I mean, that's we can stop there and be inspired and generosity and all of that. But the story didn't stop there. That car, that poor car, had more fender benders and door dings than I can count. Like, no matter where they parked, it seemed inevitable. They were destined to come out and see a note on the windshield that just said, "Hey, sorry, I hit your car. Here's my number." And every time the responsible party would cover the damage. They'd pay him in cash, and hey, here's the thing. And if it was a dent they could live with or a scratch they didn't mind, well, great. That went into the bank account. Helped to pay some other bills. This car, affectionately and aptly named Winky because it never had 2 working headlights at any given point in time, served to not only get them where their family needed to go, but also help pay a lot of bills and some much-needed repairs on their home. God works in mysterious ways, and he does the miraculous just like the 5 loaves and 2 fish. But the greater miracle is how he turns hearts of stone into hearts of flesh that have the capacity for love and generosity. That God is more glorified when his people care for the needy at their own expense. That God looks more amazing when his followers find joy and fulfillment in giving their hard-earned wages to help a family that's falling on hard times. That's what it means to manage our money with eternity in mind, like the series tagline says. Worship is giving, so we give sacrificially. We give to meet a need. And we find the greatest benefit when we make a habit of it. And that's our last component of worshiping with our finances. Make a habit of giving. Make it a regular practice. I'm reading a book right now called Habits of the Household by Justin Earley. It's about using the natural rhythms of our homes and discipling our children. And the author started saying a blessing over his kids at bedtime, and he recounts how awkward it was staring his 7-year-old son in his eyes, holding his face in the palm of his hands while he spoke. It was weird and difficult. But after a week of this, every single night, the son preempts his father and says, "Daddy, can I have my blessing now?" And the author makes this observation. He says, something we've done had become something we do. We need to move giving from something we've done to something that we do. Move from voluntary, intentional effort, which is great, to involuntary identity. moving from we have given to we are givers. And we see this in the birth of the church. In Acts chapter 2, verse 45 says, "And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need." It was an ongoing practice. They were selling their possessions and distributing as any had needs. They made a habit of it so that no one would go without. They didn't just meet the need and then, see you later. It was an ongoing thing. And God used the generosity of his people to meet the needs of his people, which we'll talk more about next week. But also they made a habit of it because it was changing their hearts. Transformation occurs through habit, not happenstance. You're not healthy because you went to the gym. You're getting healthy because you're going to the gym, provided you're doing things that you're supposed to do at a gym. Habitual giving is transformative. When we make a habit out of worship, it keeps us humble before the Lord. It keeps our posture appropriate before God Most High. Giving financially helps us relate to money properly as a tool to honor the Lord. So by making a habit of giving, we're exercising that humility while constantly reaffirming the role that money should have in our lives. So if you're thinking you should start giving, you've got $20, don't drop $20 in the box on the way out the door and then just wait for the next giving series to come around. It's probably going to be a while. Instead, give $5 a week for the next month. Establish a habit. Create a rhythm. Rather than adding something you've done to your history, add something you do to your present. Become a giver. And that's where transformation occurs. It's where our hearts change, where we find the greatest benefit of financial giving. And one of those benefits, if not the greatest benefit, is how it changes us, how it changes our priorities and our will, our desire. When we make a habit of giving sacrificially, we hold on to the things of this world a little more loosely. Not that we get loose with our finances, but we're just not so easily ensnared and entangled by the things that our dollars can acquire and accumulate. We don't care as much about leather seats and home theater system and $9 bars of soap. That last one's mine, by the way. Getting a little vulnerable. I like nice soap. I got to be careful. But we don't care. Some of you are sitting here going, wouldn't have expected that. We don't care as much about these things because we're learning to value the eternal more than the temporal. We're starting to value what has significance in someone's life and their eternity more than what brings us pleasure. We're learning to value the eternal more than the temporal. We find more worth in what impacts a brother's heart or a sister's home. So when we have much to give, we're not seduced into self-indulgence, as we talked about last week. Instead, we give to that family in need. And when we don't have much at all, when we are that family in need, we're not distraught by lack of supply. Our joy is no longer tied to what we gain, but to what we give when we find more joy in giving than in having. Find more joy in giving than in having. In the book, Spiritual Disciplines for a Christian Life by Donald Whitney, he lays out very practical steps to find the most joy in life through these ongoing practices. And chapter 8 is on stewardship. And it's broken into two parts, time and money. And the money section is almost exclusively about giving. It's not about budget. It's not about expenditure. It's about giving. And towards the end of it, he says this: I've never known anyone who gave sacrificially who regretted it. Sure, they missed having some of the things they could have enjoyed if they spent the money on themselves, but the joy and fulfillment they gained by giving away something they could not ultimately keep was more giving. Just as there's great joy to be found in a life of worship, because worship is giving. Worship is sacrificial. So make a habit of giving sacrificially to meet the needs that God's going to set before you. And you'll see your heart transformed and your life filled with joy.